The fog over London. When MI6 learned to disappear, London breathed under a veil of silver fog that crept along the Thames and slithered between narrow cobblestone alleys. Horse-drawn carriages rumbled past, their wheels echoing like distant drums, while the footsteps of countless pedestrians intermingled in a symphony of ordinary chaos. Yet beneath this surface of mundane life, the seeds of something extraordinary were taking root. MI6 was not yet the globally renowned intelligence service it would become. But within these streets, shadowed by mist and mystery, the foundations of an unparalleled art of observation and disappearance were quietly forming. From the very first days of training, recruits were immersed in the city itself. The fog was their teacher, the lampposts their mentors, and the unsuspecting Londoners their unwitting classroom. Trainees learned that to disappear was not merely to evade sight, but to become invisible in memory, to move within the rhythm of the city without disturbing it. Even the slightest misstep, a hand brushing against a railing too conspicuously, a glance held too long, could betray a watcher's presence. Every gesture had to be attuned, every breath measured, and every footfall synchronized with the urban tempo. The initial exercises began near Fleet Street, a bustling district alive with vendors, journalists, and merchants. Recruits followed targets across crowded marketplaces, through twisting alleys, and past the grand facades of theaters, always remaining a step behind, yet unseen. Observation became a silent ballet, a choreography of patience and subtlety. The instructors, ever watchful, would mark successes and failures meticulously, teaching that mastery of London's rhythm was as essential as any formal espionage skill. Trainees quickly learned that the city itself could be manipulated as an ally. A passing cart might conceal movement. The fog would blur outlines, distort shadows, and delay recognition. Agents were trained to merge with the environment, to lean casually against walls, to linger near lampposts as if awaiting nothing, to fold into crowds with such natural ease that no one ever remembered they had been there. It was not enough to evade the eye. The mind of the observer had to remain oblivious. At night, exercises became even more demanding. The lamplight cut golden streaks through the mist, creating a labyrinth of light and shadow. Trainees practiced blending into these shifting patterns, timing their steps to coincide with noises of carriages, distant conversations, or the soft clatter of horses' hooves. One misaligned step could betray them, but success meant complete invisibility amidst the bustling nocturnal life. Repetition honed instinct, patience, and an intimate understanding of human behavior. One particularly rigorous mission involved a courier carrying sensitive documents weaving through Covent Garden. The agent had to shadow the messenger unnoticed, navigating crowds of vendors and theatergoers, slipping silently across streets and through plazas, all without drawing attention. Each movement was critical. A subtle stumble, a misread gesture, or a delayed response could jeopardize the entire exercise. These missions demanded endurance, heightened senses, and the ability to anticipate human behavior with almost prescient accuracy. Outside the structured exercises, the city continued its relentless rhythm. Street cries, the clang of market stalls, and the faint whistle of distant trains formed a complex soundscape that trainees learned to interpret and utilize. Every alleyway, every crowded square, every narrow bridge offered both opportunity and risk. The goal was never mere evasion. It was the complete fusion with the city's flow, becoming a shadow within shadows, a ghost moving through fog. Weeks of training forged a profound philosophy. To disappear in London was to become unremarkable, ordinary, yet ever-present. The watchers had to be indistinguishable from the very streets they patrolled. Observation alone was insufficient. Memory, attention, and perception of those around them had to be anticipated, manipulated, and ultimately rendered irrelevant. By mastering these lessons, MI6 agents learned to vanish while still gathering the intelligence necessary to safeguard their nation. And as the fog rolled thicker over the river at dawn, reflecting the dim glow of gas lamps on wet cobblestones, MI6 trainees understood a truth that would define their agency for generations. Disappearance was not a trick, nor a mere skill. It was an art, one that required patience, discipline, and a complete harmony with the world around them. Because from that night onward, MI6 realized something extraordinary. London wasn't just teaching them how to follow, it was teaching them how to vanish. And this discovery became the seed of an art form that would one day define British intelligence, the art of disappearing even when standing in plain sight. London's streets were alive with movement, yet cloaked in a gray, shifting veil that transformed even the busiest thoroughfares into a landscape of hidden opportunity. For MI6 recruits, the fog was no longer merely an atmospheric phenomenon, it was a tool, a partner in their clandestine education. Every lamppost became a sentinel, every corner a lesson in concealment, and every passerby a puzzle in human behavior to be decoded silently. Trainees learned that blending into the urban landscape required more than physical stillness. It required psychological invisibility, an ability to fade, not just from sight, but from memory and expectation. The exercises began at dusk, when the gas lamps flickered to life along Whitechapel and the embankments near the Thames. Recruits were tasked with following couriers, diplomats, and ordinary Londoners alike without ever drawing attention. Their instructors observed from shadows, noting every misstep, every twitch, every lapse in composure. The objective was not to intimidate or coerce, but to exist within the flow of the city as though they were part of a moving element of the fog itself. One evening, a trainee named Thomas Harper was assigned to tail a minor government clerk transporting sensitive messages. The streets were congested with vendors packing up their stalls, families returning home, and street performers attempting last-minute tricks. Thomas melted into the crowd, matching the clerk's pace, timing his turns, and pausing precisely when the clerk paused. The fog softened his outlines, the lamplight refracted around his form, and he became indistinguishable from the myriad pedestrians around him. The instructor's note that evening read simply, "Invisible, yet aware. See all, disturb none." It was the creed of MI6 operatives, the fundamental principle of shadow work. Recruits internalized it through repetition, observing not only the physical actions of those they followed, but also the subtle interplay of glances, gestures, and unspoken reactions that occurred within the crowded streets. Meanwhile, in quieter neighborhoods, MI6 experimented with techniques of indirect observation. Agents would position themselves behind opaque shop windows, mirror angles, and discreet corners, tracking movements without ever approaching too closely. They learned to predict patterns. A man leaving a coffee house would always glance at the same lamppost. A clerk crossing Fleet Street would take the same footpath. A carriage would pause at the exact point each evening. By cataloging these rhythms, the trainees learned to anticipate behavior and remain perpetually in control, even when their presence was undetectable. The fog itself became a living instructor. Its density shifted unpredictably, sometimes revealing, sometimes concealing, forcing recruits to constantly adapt. Mist curled around buildings, obscured faces, and distorted sound, teaching observers to rely on intuition as much as sight. They were drilled in peripheral awareness, noting the subtle tension in a shoulder, the faint rustle of a coat, or the hesitation in a passerby's stride, all indicators that the city, for those trained, spoke volumes. At night, when shadows deepened and the gaslight haloed the streets in amber rings, exercises became more elaborate. Trainees were instructed to follow multiple targets simultaneously, adjusting for variables like horse-drawn carriages, pedestrians changing pace, and street musicians whose sudden notes could mask or reveal movement. The challenge was to remain unnoticed while collecting information with absolute accuracy. Success meant moving like a ghost. Failure meant exposure, and exposure could compromise entire operations. In one complex exercise, 3 agents were tasked to converge on a single target from different starting points across Westminster. They were invisible to one another, and the fog masked their movements from any civilian observers. The agent's objective was to relay observations without verbal communication, using coded hand signals and subtle gestures. This exercise honed both their awareness and coordination, teaching them that shadows could communicate, coordinate, and protect in ways words never could. By the end of these rigorous weeks, MI6 trainees internalized the ultimate lesson. A shadow could be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Blending into the environment was not merely a tactic, it became a philosophy. Each lamppost they passed, each narrow alley they traversed, each pedestrian they observed was a thread in a tapestry of intelligence they were weaving invisibly across the city. These shadows behind the lampposts were more than training exercises. They were the birth of a methodology that would define British espionage. London had taught MI6 to vanish, but these exercises taught them to operate within that disappearance, to move freely, gather intelligence, and emerge unrecognized, all while remaining an integral part of the city's living rhythm. And as the fog deepened around Westminster and the bridges spanning the Thames whispered with mist and echo, MI6 realized that mastery of invisibility required more than stealth. It demanded patience, awareness, and the understanding that the city itself was both mentor and confederate, a partner in the unseen dance of espionage. Because from that night onward, MI6 realized something extraordinary. London wasn't just teaching them how to follow, it was teaching them how to vanish. In the heart of Whitehall, behind unassuming doors and corridors lined with aged portraits of statesmen, the silent rooms of MI6 awaited their recruits. These rooms were unlike any conventional classroom. There were no blackboards, no lectures, no conventional instruction. Instead, they offered isolation, observation, and the controlled tension of an invisible classroom. Each trainee entered these rooms knowing that their every movement would be noted, yet nothing would be spoken aloud. Silence was not just a rule. It was the medium through which intelligence, discipline, and intuition were honed to razor-sharp precision. The rooms were dimly lit, the soft glow of overhead lamps reflecting off polished wooden panels, casting elongated shadows across walls and floors. Recruits learned to navigate the rooms as they would London's foggy streets. Every step measured, every gesture deliberate. Exercises involved the subtle tracking of instructors who moved unseen, whispering only through coded signals and minimal hand gestures. The challenge was to notice, remember, and interpret without ever revealing one's awareness. In one exercise, trainees were seated at long tables, pretending to take notes while an instructor moved behind partitions, performing minor actions designed to test observation. A dropped pen, a flicker of light across a wall, the barely audible creak of a floorboard became lessons in perception. Recruits were expected to record what they observed mentally, reconstructing the sequence of events with precision hours later. Mistakes were lessons. Accuracy was rewarded with trust and greater responsibility. The rooms also housed rudimentary simulation devices. Simple mechanical timers, rotating lanterns, and miniature maps of London allowed recruits to practice coordination, timing, and anticipation. They mapped potential escape routes, observed blind spots, and rehearsed procedures for following or disappearing from targets in the field. By the end of each day, the trainees' awareness extended beyond their immediate surroundings. They could anticipate events, recognize patterns, and remain alert without overt movement. Crucially, these silent rooms emphasized the psychological aspects of espionage. Trainees were exposed to distractions, intentionally created sounds, shifting light patterns, and confounding movements designed to mislead attention. Their task was to maintain focus, observe subtly, and differentiate meaningful signals from irrelevant noise. Instructors taught that success in intelligence required a mind as disciplined as the body, capable of noticing the unnoticed and interpreting the unspoken. Another training module involved multi-agent coordination. Recruits were placed in separate rooms connected by narrow passageways and mirrors, observing one another without verbal contact. Each trainee had to anticipate another's movements, synchronize silently, and maintain the illusion of inaction. These exercises mirrored real-world operations, where agents would operate in proximity to colleagues and adversaries alike, yet remain undetectable to all but the most attuned eyes. Even the architecture of the rooms reinforced lessons in invisibility and observation. High ceilings and reflective surfaces challenged depth perception, while narrow corridors created false perspectives, teaching recruits to adjust their perception to deceptive environments. They learned to approach, withdraw, and relocate with subtlety, understanding that mastery over space and perception could turn even ordinary rooms into arenas of intelligence. By the end of weeks spent within Whitehall's silent rooms, recruits had absorbed a philosophy that would define MI6 for decades. Invisibility was not merely physical, it was mental, spatial, and behavioral. The silent rooms were laboratories for the mind, preparing agents to merge seamlessly with their surroundings, anticipate human behavior, and remain undetected while gathering intelligence critical to national security. The fog of London had taught them to vanish among streets and shadows, but the silent rooms taught them to operate within the void itself, to be present, vigilant, and imperceptible simultaneously. Here MI6's legacy of psychological finesse, precision observation, and covert coordination was forged, layer by layer, in silence and subtlety. And as the final exercise concluded for the day, the recruits exited into the foggy streets of Whitehall, carrying with them an understanding that would become the backbone of British espionage: the ability to exist unnoticed, yet always aware, a ghost among the living. 'Cause from that night onward, MI6 realized something extraordinary. London wasn't just teaching them how to follow, it was teaching them how to vanish. And in the silent rooms of Whitehall, they had learned to operate within the void itself. But the next challenge awaited beyond the walls. The city's fog itself became a courier, carrying secrets in shapes and shadows, in movements invisible to the untrained eye. MI6 soon realized that information did not merely travel along predictable routes. It flowed in the spaces between streets, in subtle gestures, and in seemingly insignificant signals that only a trained observer could detect. The operation began at dawn, when London was both awake and quiet, streets half-lit by gas lamps, mist curling along the bridges and quay walls. Trainees were tasked with following the journey of coded messages hidden within envelopes, parcels, and the ordinary movements of couriers who blended seamlessly into everyday life. Each step required acute awareness, for a single missed detail could render the intelligence lost forever. Agents shadowed clerks, street vendors, and pedestrians, each carrying vital snippets of information. The couriers themselves were unaware of the observers, yet every subtle adjustment in their grip, pace, or glance carried significance. MI6 trainees learned to read these signs, decoding hidden cues while remaining invisible. It was an intricate dance. Move too close, and suspicion arose. Too far, and the signal was lost. Night exercises involved multiple layers of observation. A single message might be relayed by 3 or 4 agents across different districts, each maintaining absolute secrecy. Trainees had to track, memorize, and reconstruct the route, noting each pause, exchange, and environmental cue. The fog aided them by masking outlines and distorting sound, yet it also posed risk. For misjudgment in the mist could result in the loss of intelligence or inadvertent exposure. Communication itself became an art. Hand signals, coded knocks, and carefully placed objects were used to relay progress along the route. MI6 developed a system where the streets themselves served as an extension of the agency. Lampposts marked checkpoints, benches indicated pauses, and patterns in everyday human movement acted as verification signals. Every element of the urban environment became a letter, a word, a sentence in the language of espionage. One particularly complex exercise involved a sequence where a single document passed through 5 couriers within a single fog-shrouded district. Each agent had to transfer the item seamlessly, without verbal communication, and without leaving evidence of the handoff. Observers outside the operation would watch silently, recording minute deviations, timing, and environmental shifts. The fog amplified the difficulty, providing cover for both the couriers and the agents. Success meant that the message reached its destination unaltered, and no observer had ever detected the operation's existence. In parallel, trainees were introduced to the concept of misdirection. Decoy messages, false routes, and deliberate timing errors were employed to teach agents how to discern truth from deception. The ability to differentiate between real and false signals became critical, as in actual operations, misinformation could easily compromise national security. The fog of London became both adversary and ally masking, confusing and guiding simultaneously. By mastering the journey of these hidden messages, MI6 agents internalized the principle that intelligence was alive. It moved, shifted, and adapted in real time. Observation alone was insufficient. They needed intuition, anticipation, and the ability to predict outcomes while remaining invisible themselves. They became conduits for secrecy, moving within the city like ghosts, ensuring the continuity of information without ever drawing attention. As the fog thickened over the Thames and the glow of lanterns refracted in damp air, MI6 trainees understood a fundamental truth. Information could travel undetected, but only through meticulous observation, coordination, and the skillful manipulation of environment and perception. The streets of London were no longer mere pathways. They had become arteries of intelligence, carrying the lifeblood of espionage under the watchful eyes of agents who had learned the art of vanishing. And in that ethereal mist, where shadows blurred and lights glimmered faintly on wet stone, MI6 realized that mastery of intelligence depended not only on secrecy, but on invisibility, subtlety, and a profound connection with the city itself, lesson that would resonate across decades of British espionage. Because from that night onward, MI6 realized something extraordinary. London wasn't just teaching them how to follow. It was teaching them how to vanish. The fog had become a teacher, the streets a canvas, and the shadows the medium through which agents would learn to exist unseen. Then came the night that would etch itself into the memory of every trainee. A night when the city seemed to dissolve into abstraction. A night when familiar streets lost their shape and landmarks became phantoms in a swirling sea of mist. It began quietly. A dense fog rolled over the Thames, creeping into the alleys, courtyards, and squares of Westminster. Gas lamps flickered weakly, their halos fragmented by the damp haze. Buildings that stood steadfastly during the day melted into amorphous silhouettes. Even the river seemed to shift its course under the veil of silver, its surface reflecting distorted shapes that tricked the mind into seeing movement where there was none. MI6 agents were deployed in pairs, tasked with tracking a series of couriers carrying critical intelligence. Yet the city itself had become a labyrinth. Familiar streets were rendered alien, shadows blended into shadows, and the fog carried echoes of footsteps that were not there. Agents had to rely on instinct as much as training. Visual cues were unreliable. The sounds of the city became as important as the sights. The agent's senses were stretched to their limits. In one exercise, a recruit named Eleanor Marsh found herself following a courier along an alley near St. James's Park. The fog obscured corners, distorted distances, and refracted lamplight into strange, shifting patterns. Each turn brought uncertainty. A doorway that seemed to lead one way now appeared to bend around the street. A bench became a phantom, and a passerby seemed twice as large or small, depending on the mist's density. Eleanor learned to slow her breath, measure her pace against the rhythm of the city, and trust the internal map she had memorized of landmarks that could no longer be relied upon visually. Meanwhile, instructors observed from rooftops and hidden vantage points, noting how trainees adapted to the changing environment. They provided subtle guidance through hand signals, but minimal intervention was permitted. The objective was for agents to learn adaptability, improvisation, and a keen awareness that the world around them could shift unpredictably at any moment. The fog also concealed deliberate decoys, false couriers, staged handoffs, and misleading reflections in puddles. Agents were required to distinguish genuine intelligence pathways from distractions, to anticipate errors, and to execute observation without interference. Every decision, every step, every pause could determine the success or failure of the operation. By midnight, the city had transformed completely. Westminster Bridge became a corridor of shadows. The river's reflections formed moving patterns that could mislead even the most experienced eyes. Agents coordinated silently through subtle signals, timing their moves with precision, ensuring that intelligence reached its intended recipient without detection. Those who succeeded moved like phantoms, integrated seamlessly with the urban rhythm, while those who faltered learned invaluable lessons in patience, perception, and psychological resilience. Through this exercise, MI6 codified a principle that would endure in the fog. Shapes are deceptive, and perception is both a weapon and a vulnerability. Agents learned that mastery of invisibility demanded not only technical skill, but also mental agility and the ability to navigate ambiguity. The city itself became a collaborator, offering cover and challenge in equal measure. As dawn approached, the fog began to lift, revealing streets that had once seemed distorted and alien. Agents who had navigated the night emerged, physically unchanged but mentally transformed. They carried with them the understanding that invisibility was not static. It was dynamic, responsive, and interwoven with the world they observed. London had lost its shape, yet MI6 had gained a profound lesson in adaptation, anticipation, and silent mastery. And as the morning light touched the Thames and reflected on the now familiar buildings, MI6 trainees understood that the art of disappearance is not only about vanishing from sight, was about moving within uncertainty, embracing ambiguity, and thriving when the world itself became a shifting, unpredictable landscape. Because from that night onward, MI6 realized something extraordinary. London wasn't just teaching them how to follow. It was teaching them how to vanish. Through the fog, the shadows, and the silent corridors of Whitehall, they had learned to blend, anticipate, and operate unseen. Now, it was time to master the final frontier, moving through barriers not just of sight, but of perception, space, and expectation. The exercise began in the heart of Whitehall, in rooms that were both familiar and treacherous. Instructors introduced a new challenge. Agents would traverse areas filled with obstacles, locked doors, shadowed corridors, narrow stairwells, and layered security checkpoints without drawing attention, without leaving traces, and without ever being detected by other personnel. It was not about literal magic. It was about mastery of timing, prediction, and psychological manipulation of observers. Agents were assigned to track a high-value courier moving across multiple floors. Each movement had to be perfectly synchronized with the environment. In one room, the light flickered unexpectedly. The agents adjusted their paths, timing their steps to coincide with shadows and ambient noises. Doors were opened only when no one was watching, and at times they appeared to vanish simply by standing still in plain view. Their presence masked by careful observation and subtle blending with surroundings. The corridors themselves became part of the lesson. MI6 trainers manipulated the environment, changing light angles, introducing random passersby, and simulating alarm triggers. Agents learned to anticipate reactions, read body language, and use distraction to their advantage. A single misstep could compromise the operation. Yet each success reinforced the fundamental skill to exist unseen while fully aware, moving with the confidence that the walls themselves could not contain their purpose. One agent, Edward Chambers, became the exemplar of this discipline. He navigated through multiple rooms, tracing the courier's path while avoiding both direct observation and surveillance equipment. Every glance he took, every movement he made, was imperceptible to the casual eye, yet meticulously noted by his instructors. By the end of the exercise, Edward's performance demonstrated what MI6 had long taught. Invisibility was not only a physical skill, but a mental state, a harmony between perception, anticipation, and precise action. Meanwhile, in parallel simulations, recruits were tested on their ability to relay information without leaving traces. Coded messages were passed using subtle gestures, light reflections, and even the positioning of everyday objects. Each interaction was rehearsed to perfection, teaching agents to use ordinary elements of the environment as tools of intelligence, communication, and concealment. By midday, the trainees were executing movements so seamless that observers could not tell they were present. Doors opened and closed, corridors cleared, and intelligence flowed without detection. The final lesson crystallized. MI6 operatives could move through walls, not literally but through the barriers of expectation, perception, and attention. The city, the rooms, and the fog were no longer obstacles. They were partners in a ballet of intelligence and stealth. In the evening, as London's fog thickened once more over the Thames, the culmination exercise began. Agents were tasked with a complex cross-district operation, shadowing multiple targets while coordinating in silence, transferring messages and ensuring that no observation could compromise the mission. It was a test of all they had learned: the integration of invisibility, anticipation, psychological acuity, and environmental mastery. When the exercise concluded, instructors convened to debrief the agents. Notes were shared, observations highlighted, and the successes catalogued. Yet the most significant lesson was not tactical-led, was philosophical. MI6 had transcended the simple act of following or hiding. Its agents had learned to operate within the very essence of London itself, moving as part of the city's rhythm, as ghosts that existed both everywhere and nowhere. As the fog lifted into the early hours of dawn, a sense of accomplishment and clarity settled over the trainees. They had walked through walls, not by supernatural means, but through mastery of invisibility, anticipation, and the profound understanding that perception is reality. The silent rooms, the fog-laden streets, and the shadowed lampposts had combined to teach a single truth. An MI6 agent moves unseen, not just with skill, but with the awareness that every environment, every human, and every moment is part of the unseen network they inhabit. And now, as this chapter of training came to an end, it was time for the trainees to step fully into the world beyond Whitehall, carrying with them the lessons of invisibility, the art of disappearing, and the knowledge that the fog of London, the shadows behind every lamppost, and the silent corridors of power would always be allies in the delicate dance of espionage. Disclaimer and public MSG. Hello everyone. An important note. This story is based on historical and factual records about MI6 and British intelligence. It is intended purely for documentary and informational purposes. The channel does not take sides or pass judgment on any individuals or organizations mentioned. We'd love to hear from you. Tell us where you are watching from, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it. Drop your comments below. We'd love to know your thoughts and insights. Your engagement helps us continue to bring detailed cinematic spy stories to the channel.